So this is really surprising news. I just sitting down to record this now because I've been out all day, so I haven't been able to sit down and give my reaction on video. So if you haven't heard, Brad Stevens or Danny Ainge has stepped down as president of basketball operations for the Boston Celtics, and Brad Stevens will be taking his job and no longer coaching for the team. Now, it's pretty surprising because I thought if one of them were to go, it would have been Ainge because, the direction this team was going, this was probably the worst roster or worst season even that the Celtics have had in years, and it seemed like he was starting to get a bit of an expiration date. Some of his acquisitions weren't there. His keenness, I guess, wasn't on top, and then he also dealt with some health issues. But I thought Brad Stevens still had some time to prove himself because he's been a great head coach mostly every other season. But and you could just chalk this up to saying, hey, the Celtics didn't have enough rest time, and the whole COVID situation kind of made things a bit murky. But it'll be interesting to see how this team goes forward. But let's go to Ainge because I feel like he's been scrutinized for the past few seasons, myself included, because he will leave the Boston Celtics having two legacies to his name. One, being the recipient of potentially the greatest trade heist in not even basketball history, but in major professional sports history. But also, on the other side, despite getting the gobs of assets from that deal and other trades he made, he was never able to even get the Celtics in a position to make, or not in a position, the Celtics never made an NBA Finals, let alone win one. There was always the thing that he would never give up any assets for star players. I mean, how many times did we hear reports saying the Boston Celtics almost traded for X player? They didn't trade for him. They almost traded. I mean, there was Paul George, Jimmy Butler, DeMarcus Cousins, Vucevic, Kawhi, Anthony Davis was in trade rumors. There's so many players that the Celtics could have acquired, but simply didn't. Whether it was because of the whole Isaiah Thomas situation that made impending free agents weary of staying in Boston, or just the fact that Danny Ainge didn't want to give up on certain assets. They never got him in a situation. And then there was the whole Gordon Hayward situation where he had two good assets lined up in Miles Turner and Doug McDermott, and he got greedy and wanted more, and then Gordon Hayward left for nothing. And I want to talk about also the Kemba Walker signing, because that was a signing where on paper it made sense. Kyrie Irving left, so you had the void of the point guard position. You didn't have that shot combo guard shot creator role, and Kemba Walker was the next best available option. But the problem is Kemba Walker's ceiling is nowhere near Kyrie's, and his floor usually is much lower, and he's very inconsistent. And add on to it now, he's been dealing with some injury issues, and especially in these playoffs in the last season, and now it looks like one of the more untradeable contracts. And also Danny Ainge's draft acumen, despite keeping all these picks, I think he had 5 firsts in the last 3 years, he really hasn't done much with them. I mean, there's Grant Williams, there's Semi Ojeleye, Gershon Yabusele. I know these aren't part of the 3, but I was thinking of some of the worst picks. And besides from Tatum and Jaylen Brown, out of the last few years, the Celtics haven't made a really great first-round pick, and that's the reason why their talent is so depleted, because they have no depth on their roster. And now you're in a position where you're very top-heavy with 2 All-Stars, Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown, and then the rest of the team is kind of inconsistent, whatever. I know you have Marcus Smart and Kemba Walker, but how much longer are they on the team? And then it's a lot of young guys who have some potential, but haven't been consistent enough or haven't been healthy long enough to really pencil them in as solid players going into the future. So Danny Ainge is going to, hope he has a good retirement, but he's going to have a legacy where, despite having 7 first-round picks and being the recipient of the greatest fleece in maybe major sports history, they have 0 finals to show for it. And now they're in a position where do you go from here? Because you don't have high first-round picks, and you only have two legitimate players to keep on this team, and then a bunch of role players whose future with the team is very uncertain. So now let's transition to Brad Stevens. Brad Stevens is no longer the head coach of the Celtics. He will be taking over Ainge as president of basketball operations. I'll talk first about his coaching. So now, I was always a big believer in Brad. I thought he was one of the 3 best coaches in the league, really for the past 5 or so years. I mean, his ability to elevate talent, lesser talent to high standards, his game playing, his X's and O's, his defensive schemes, having lineups with Isaiah Thomas still rank amongst the best in NBA in terms of defense, but it seemed this year that he like didn't have it all together. And kind of hearing the reports now, it makes sense. The Celtics' offensive game plan would stagnate. It really just turned to Jason Tatum, Jaylen Brown, ISOs. There weren't a lot of design plays, which you can also argue there weren't the talent to create set design plays for, and they didn't have like the playmakers around them. And their defensive schemes are horrible. Despite having 3 legitimate defenders, and then Robert Williams, who's also emerging as a solid defender. They were middle of the road, below average in terms of defense. And then there was the whole, locker room situation where, I forget when it was, but Jason Tatum was taking a post-game interview, and you could hear furniture being thrown and Brad Stevens screaming in the locker room. And so there was that idea where, like, the team wasn't gelling together, and there was some clashing of egos. But I thought if he got a better hand in terms of roster, I think he would have done a better job than he did this year because, to be fair, Danny Ainge did not put Brad Stevens in the best position to succeed. So now for his role in present basketball operations, I think there are 2 angles you can take with this. One, Brad Stevens has worked with exceptional talent and knows what good talent looks like, and especially when it comes to diamonds in the rough, he knows how he can elevate the guys like Robert Williams, Jay Crowder, Avery Bradley, Marcus Smart, guys who were kind of more low-key. I mean, Marcus Smart was a high prospect. Players who are more low-key can elevate them. So you can say he has a knack for finding talent. And I mean, he was a coach at Butler, and he made 2 national championship appearances, and the only notable player on that roster was Gordon Hayward, who he himself wasn't really that highly touted of a prospect. But then you also think on the other side of saying, well, he probably had more influence in the decisions the last few years. And so now you're thinking, well, was he the one who swayed the team to pick like Semi Ojeleye or Gershon Yabusele or Grant Williams? And then it turns into saying like, well, then he can evaluate talent. So is it saying, well, he really can't evaluate talent, and the more influence he's had on the team, it could be a cause to why he's doing worse? And then there's also the other aspect of, well, how good is he managing salary cap? He's never had been in a salary cap situation. Even as a college coach, there's no salary cap. So that'll also be another nuance for them to figure out. And even though he will be involved in the head coaching process, and Brad Stevens is a great head coach, and if it takes a great coach to find a great head coach, but it's very unlikely that they find a head coach who is on par to Brad Stevens. I mean, it's very impossible. Even the candidates I hear they're rumored to come, Lloyd Pierce and Jason Kidd, might be some of the worst examples of head coaches, because we know that Jason Kidd in his time in Milwaukee and Brooklyn weren't the best. You could give him credit for developing Giannis, but a lot of, the instances involving him, especially with the DUIs and the spilling of the drink when he was with Brooklyn, and then Lloyd Pierce, after his time in Atlanta, Nate McMillan takes over, and they suddenly look like one of the best teams in basketball. So it's not too bright. I mean, if I were thinking of head coaches to hire, I always go back to Kenny Atkinson and Adrian Griffin, because they were some of the ones I thought were among the best remaining coaching candidates when the last coaching carousel came through. So, Boston's in a really tough situation. They're going to have to do a lot of soul searching. I would assume one of Kemba Walker or Marcus Smart is traded just to reload on some assets. Maybe you have to dump away a couple of future firsts, and maybe Brad Stevens is more likely to do that than Danny Ainge was ever willing to do. But they're in a really tough scenario right now. They have a roster. They're against the salary cap. They have Evan Fournier as an impending free agent. They only have a couple of, pieces that are legitimate as of right now. There are some who the potential to be good, but they only have really a few foundational pieces, and they're really stuck in this no man's land. So it's going to be an interesting offseason for the Boston Celtics and company. Brad Stevens is going to be tested day one on how he's going to rebuild this roster, because if he does a poor rebuild job, we could be talking about Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown being traded within the next couple of years. So that'll do it for this video. Danny Ainge steps down as president of basketball operations for the Boston Celtics. Brad Stevens will take over immediately, and he will resign as head coach of the Celtics. He'll go from head coach to president of basketball operations. So that'll do it for this video. I'm out. Peace.